introduce an old friend of mine, Professor Leiderman. He is the chief economist of Bank Hapoalim, teaches at Tel Aviv University. He was head of emerging markets at the Deutsche Bank in the early 2000s. He serves as head of research. He served as the head of research department in the Bank of Israel from 1996 to 2000. He served in a different variety of important economic positions at a global level. I want also to remark that we played together soccer in the Kibbutz Bachan, and we studied in the same library, University of Chicago, some time ago, when Milton Friedman actually received the Nobel Prize. Leo Leiderman will speak to us about global economic trends.
Thanks a lot, Ephraim, or Froike, as we know you. Actually, I was counting the years, and I think we met for the first time 43 years ago, which make the 20 years of BESA a real young celebration. And as Uzi, I want to congratulate you for the great achievements and all what you have done and you are doing here. I would like to share with you, I would say, 4 main thoughts in terms of the recent economic trends and their potential implications from a strategic perspective. And I'm sure that you guys are much more experts than I am in terms of the politics of strategy and the strategy of politics and any combination you want to find among these issues. The first point I want to sort of raise has to do with where exactly we are right now in terms of the process that began with the 07-08 global economic crisis, okay? For us economists and for us macroeconomists, this is certainly a benchmark, a key event that we cannot avoid it. And for one thing, this global economic and financial crisis has not ended, and no one can really forecast with accuracy when exactly it is going to end. I guess the good news, and this is my first point, about the developments in the last 5 years, and indeed we sort of all remember that it was 5 years ago, a little more than 5 years ago, that we saw the sort of one of the most critical events in the midst of the crisis, the collapse of Lehman Brothers on September 15, 2008, okay? Exactly 5 years. Anyway, since that time, I think the good news are that when we look at the world in economic terms nowadays, October 2013, what we see is growth almost everywhere. Even some of the European economies, especially those in the periphery of the Eurozone, like Spain, Italy, and of course Portugal, Greece, and many others, are now experiencing positive growth in their economies. So that's relatively good news, and there was a lot of fear that this global economic crisis of 07-08 might sort of bring the whole world economy into a lost decade in terms of economic growth and things like that. And we are seeing that that things have been improving on the growth, economic growth front. Not only that, but most economists agree nowadays that the probability of an extreme event, of a catastrophic economic event, such as a collapse of an institution like a Lehman Brothers type institution in 2008, the probability of that tail risk event has been tremendously diminished. Okay? It's not that I'm saying that we will not see more economic crisis. In fact, just the opposite. The history of world economics and world finance tells us that, yes, there are cycles and there are crises, and no one can really color and paint and describe exactly how the next crisis will look like. But clearly it will be there. But whether we are likely to see that in the next 2-3 years, I truly believe, as most of my colleagues, that the probabilities for that have been dramatically reduced. In terms of still my first point, in an overall description of what is going on in terms of the economic trends, I want to make a point, and I will come back also to this distinction. We, nowadays, when we analyze global economic developments, as you know, we distinguish between the advanced countries or the Western economies and the emerging economies, especially of Asia, Latin America, and some of the countries in Europe. There are also the low-income countries in Africa that are, of course, going to be the new generation of emerging markets in the years to come. And it is very interesting what we have seen in terms of the role of emerging markets, which, by the way, produce nowadays 50% of world production. Those countries that China, of course, included, that we are defining as emerging market economies, are countries that include in their territory 85% of the world population, and they produce 50% of the world GDP. And these countries, of course, and this is a strategic trend that I will want to emphasize at the end from the point of view of Israel, the relative importance of the emerging market economies and within that, the relative importance of the Asian region is going to continue growing over the years. And that is an element that, in spite of the crisis and in spite of anything you can read and think about, it is going on, especially due to demographic trends, due to fundamental trends, due to the growth of a massive new middle class that has a demand for automobiles, for new housing, and for all kinds of consumer appliances, and so on and so forth. Initially, in the crisis, we saw some sort of a decoupling of emerging market economies from the advanced countries. In contrast to some previous crises, like the Mexico crisis, the Russia crisis of 1998, the current global economic crisis is a crisis of the US and Europe. It's a crisis of the mere center of capitalism, the mere center of the world economy, the advanced countries. This is where it all began. And quite interestingly, initially there was no contagion for the emerging market economies. Yet over the last 2 years, we have seen that even the most successful so-called BRIC countries, Brazil, Russia, India, and China, have been sort of infected by some of the diseases that we are seeing over the years. And so if you look at the developments, take a country like Brazil as an example, that everybody was talking in positive terms about Brazil. Brazil nowadays is not looking in very good shape politically, socially, and economically. So this is in terms of my first point. The second point is to say, okay, we have described the good news, but are we sure that policymakers, especially in the Western economies, in the advanced countries, have really dealt with the root causes of the crisis? And here, I think that we are getting more and more to the point that there is a presumption that, as in medicine, there has been a very successful treatment of the symptoms, but there has been a relatively weak treatment of the true root causes. The main reason for the rapid recovery, and of course we have to admire really policymakers for the very rapid recovery that they produced in the Western economy and in the global economy, the main reason has been the very rapid reaction of central banks. No one can really describe the speedy recovery and the fact that everyone seems to be growing at the present time without the massive injection of liquidity and without the massive reduction in interest rates, first of all by my very good friend Ben Bernanke, second by Mario Draghi, his predecessor Trichet of the European Central Bank, and the other central bankers. You know, liquidity is like the oxygen for the economy. And so it was as if there was a big fire and the firefighters came with lots of liquidity, and that succeeded in bringing the fire down. But the true success in dealing with the crisis has to do with the need for major reforms that have to do with the financial sector, that have to do with the labor market, that have to do with incentives in the banking system, etc., etc. These reforms are very, very painful. They take time, they take a lot of effort, they take a lot of political mobilization and political consensus. And what we are seeing is that policymakers, first of all, moved very quickly to bring the fire down, but when the time has come to sit down and reflect on how to change things, it's taking a very, very long time. If you look at the banking system in the Eurozone, that is the clearest example. There are still a lot of toxic assets and a lot of elements in the assets and liability statements, in the balance sheets of Eurozone banks, especially Spanish banks, Italian banks, that need to be cleaned. Okay? The Eurozone still lacks a unified system of banking insurance, of banking supervision. You know, you have the same currency, the euro, but the banking supervision in Germany is completely different than in Spain or in Italy. And they are having a lot of trouble and political difficulty, you know, unifying or sort of aligning the national interests with the regional interests of the Eurozone. And okay, now Angela Merkel has been re-elected. We are waiting for this and that. We thought that the Italian parliament, that the Italian government is going to collapse due to Berlusconi. Now it's still alive, you know. But things they are still dealing with the day-to-day problems, and they don't get to these major problems. One main issue in this sort of half-empty glass, in terms of the global picture, has to do with the very disappointing state of the labor markets. We still have a problem of unemployment, especially in Europe. The average unemployment rate in the Eurozone is 12% of the labor force, but if you look at the young people, and in some of the countries in the periphery, like Spain or Greece, you can reach to unemployment rates of 50% for the young people. If someone is unemployed at the age of 28, 32, 35, believe me, that is going to have implications for his or her career all over the future, and that may be a permanently unemployed person for the whole of his life. In the case of the US, there has been success in reducing the unemployment rate to 7.1%. Yet, it's like good cholesterol and bad cholesterol. It has been due to the bad cholesterol, because unemployment can be reduced if you get to a position that people become sort of disappointed with searching for a job and decide sort of not to search anymore for a job. In economics, an unemployed person is a person actively searching for a job and not finding a job. So if you wake up in the morning and you say to yourself, well, you know, I'm just hopeless, so I'll go to a coffee shop to work on my next startup, as we see a lot of young people in the coffee shops in Tel Aviv, then you're not part of the labor force, you're not part of the unemployment statistics. And of course, Ben Bernanke knows very well this fact, and this is one of the reasons why the phenomenon of tapering and quantitative easing is going on and on and on. And even in September, when people thought that he was going to start the tapering, that did not happen there. The conclusion from these 2 points, and Freud, I'm getting towards the next two to sort of conclude, is that yes, there is a half full glass that with good news, but there are still elements of vulnerability in the global economy. The third point I want to make has to do with what I believe is a major crisis of the Western, and not only Western economies nowadays. And the most clear sort of sign of this is what we see nowadays in the US, with the complete paralysis of government, the shutting down of government, and the threat that by October 17, the US government may go default, may have to default on some of its liabilities. And the way I would put it is that I believe modestly that the Western world is going through a major crisis of governability. what we call in Hebrew meshilut. It's not only the US, it's the Eurozone. It's not only the Eurozone, it's Israel. It's not only Israel, it's Latin America. You just name it, and there is a problem. It's Russia. There are problems of governability. There is a major crisis of governability. You know, as it was indicated by one of the speakers, there were always problems, and there will always be problems. There were always bipartisan debates in Washington, but there was a room for compromise. And they almost never got to the point that we got at this time. You know, there were negotiations here and there, and then on a Saturday night, congressmen, senators from the two parties went to a good steakhouse in Washington, D.C. They reached a compromise, and for the benefit of the American people, on Monday morning, the markets opened, and this one gave something, and the other guy gave something. But now we reach the point that there is no dialogue and there is no sign of compromise. And who is paying the check? The American taxpayer. My very good friend, Professor Neil Ferguson from Harvard University, an economic historian, has just published a book on this subject. I didn't read the book, I read the synopsis of the book. The book is called The Great Degeneration, How Institutions Decay and Economies Die. And Ferguson explains the sort of, you use the word decline quite a few times, why if we see a decline of the Western economies and the Western societies, it has to do a lot with this phenomenon that, of course, it's going to be very, very difficult to overcome. You know, Neil's conclusions is that one needs heroic leadership and radical reform in order to overcome this problem. I would say, good luck, my friend, on that point. The fourth point I would like to make, and of course most of the public here is, the audience is from Israel, and we are seeing our politicians, our policymakers, having trouble reaching any decision, whether you want a railroad from here to Eilat, whether you want to deal with the pension system, whether you want to deal with our good news of the natural gas production and exports, a goodie that we have now in Israel. There is a problem, there is a tendency of the political systems to reach paralysis. And this is where we are, and that is going to have tremendous implications. The fourth point, and with this I will end, implications for Israel. I guess the West is not what it used to be. And there is, economically speaking, a new area of the world growing, Asia, China, Africa. And if we think of economic policy making and sort of economic planning for the decades to come, it is really, of course, without giving up on our tremendous collaboration and business cooperation with the United States and Europe, we need to focus more and more involvement and penetration of our business people to those growing areas of the world. Because the future of the world economy, in terms of the net additions to growth, the net additions to sort of economic dynamism in the world will come from those countries. The Western economies are suffering from some stagnation, aging population, and so on and so forth. Of course, once again, it's not one at the expense of the other, but clearly, economically speaking, we believe that Israel will have to position itself with a more dominant role in countries like China, where, by the way, there is a lot of admiration for the state of Israel and for all its achievements. Thank you very much.